Imagine teaching maths without any way of writing it down, so you could only use your voice to talk about formulas or equations. Not only would teaching maths be rubbish for both the student and the teacher, but without a way to visualize them, most mathematical concepts wouldn't have had the foundations to be thought of in the first place. Well, 1,000 years ago, this was the case for music. It was slow, difficult, and inaccurate to teach across generations, and musical ideas were limited to an incredibly simplified set of understandings. Music has always existed in some form. Even in our hunter-gatherer days, we used to use it for rituals and ceremonies. There isn't a huge difference between what we did then and what we do now. Striking a piece of skin tightly strapped down as a drum, blowing into a hollowed out tube, making noises with your voice, the principle is the same, it's just more refined nowadays. However, we can't exactly be sure how music sounded to our early human friends, to Aristotle, to Alexander the Great, or Augustus. A lot of our understanding and knowledge of history comes from written sources across the generations. So our understanding of music in the time before we were able to write it down is pretty much just our best guess. It's not just historical records that suffer from this though. With no way to write music down, you can't present ideas to musicians to play together at the same time. And even worse than this, the development of musical practices was at a ceiling, with most things in the West sounding like this. Please God, someone do something! Sharpen a note, add some colour, do anything! See, this is how people singing together can sound when it's written down for multiple people to follow different parts at the same time. Much more exciting. In the early 11th century, the Italian town of Arezzo was home to an elusive monk named Guido. This monk's fascination with the colours and possibility of musical harmony before any system existed to be able to understand them as we do today led him to an awesome invention. An invention that allows music to flourish in directions previously unimaginable. If you enjoy this video, please do leave a comment or a like, and please consider subscribing, as it's really going to help me out in the early stages of this channel. Chapter 1. Plainsong. The ancient civilizations, Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Aztec, Inca, Indian, Chinese, all had primitive instruments with the important feature of pitch division. By having some sounds higher and some sounds lower, melodies were able to be created. Over time, the distances between the notes eventually became closer together to allow more options of possible notes to play. The mathematician Pythagoras in 5th century Greece made crucial decisions about the distances of the notes, which we still more or less follow in the West today. The sequence of these separate notes and the distance between them are what we know as modes and scales today. Some of the first uses of these notes were in the aptly named Plainsong, a form of musical worship and chanting sung by early medieval Christian monks. Aside from getting me amped up to play Halo, Plainsong served the historical purpose of creating a foundation for early musical development. It's pretty much where modern music started. By the 7th century in Rome, for the past few hundred years, as monk chants had developed into a mental library of melodies to cover every service for every day of the year, these poor monks had a lot to remember. With nothing written down, they were expected to remember and teach future generations like parrots 118 graduals, 70 introits, 100 alleluias, 18 tracks, 107 offertories, 150 communions, 600 greater responsories, and several thousand office antiphons. Basically, it's a crazy amount to have to remember off the top of your head. It's been estimated that this repertoire amounts to the total of the works of Beethoven and Wagner together, which is 80 hours of continuous music. It would take 10 years to teach a young chorister everything he needed to remember by adulthood. But this was all religious plainsong, and people really, really wanted to appease their god. Chapter 2. Pope Greg the Great. Assumingly frustrated with the slight inconsistencies of his favourite jams, but also definitely for more political reasons that we're going to look at in a second, Pope Gregory the Great ordered the standardization of the entire chant repertoire. A mammoth task nowadays, but an impossible task when there's no way to write music down. Greg set up a master choir called the Schola Cantorum, or the School of Singers, and ordered all of the chants used to be codified into one definitive collection. It was a fairly insane undertaking. Not only was the size of the body of work phenomenal, but as Christianity spread, there were so many monastic settlements who each had highly idiosyncratic methods for memorizing and teaching the pieces. France had Gallican chant, southern Italy had Benevettan chant, Milan had Ambrosian chant, Spain had Visigothic or Mors-Arabic chant, and in England it was Sarum chant. These subtle variations to Rome felt like a challenge to their political authority and has resulted in a piece of propaganda that is more often told than the actual history itself today. Rome really didn't like the idea of their authority being ignored and these monasteries singing the chants however they goddamn please. So Pope Greg's master choir, the Schola Cantorum, acted as an authority that would travel out to monasteries and teach them how songs were supposed to be performed. They dispatched guys from the choir in Rome to go teach people when to sing it, where to sing it, and how to sing it. But naturally there was a resistance across the regions to Rome's assertion that their way was the only way. Romans saw the Northerners as uncivilized and disrespectful, while the Northerners saw the Romans as intrusive and annoying. So the Romans resorted to doing what religion does best, making things up. The story was spread across the land that a dove had visited Pope Gregory and sung to him the official licensed by God version of the chants. So you should stop questioning how they should be sung because God said so. John Hymenides, a 9th century monk and historian, reported Greg's achievements in a totally unbiased Vatican commissioned survey. Quote, "At the time, cantors of the Roman school were dispersed throughout the West and instructed the barbarians with distinction. After they died, the Western Church so corrupted the received body of chant that a certain John, a Roman cantor, was sent to Britain by way of Gaul, and John recalled the children of the churches in every place to the pristine sweetness of the Church, and preserved for many years the rule of Roman doctrine." Of course, now we know these pieces as Gregorian chants after Pope Gregory himself. Chapter 3, Guido the Greater. So, how was it possible to complete this massive job of standardizing all of the chants supposedly sung to Pope Gregory by a dove when there was no way of writing music down? Out of necessity, all over Europe, a pretty neat and civilized system had appeared. Squiggly lines above the words that are sort of roughly at the height on the paper that translates to the height of the musical pitch you make. These silly squiggly lines had an appropriately silly name. Neumes, and whilst neumes are helpful, they're not all that accurate. There was no actual reference point for what the neumes meant, just a rough guide as to whether you should sing the next note higher or lower. The composer Howard Goodall describes them as being, quote, "like a map with just the shape of the roads on them. No names, no numbers, no bearings, no north, south, east, or west." Like, you can look at this and sure, you could have a rough idea of how to sing this, but it's not going to be all that useful when there are multiple different people singing multiple different parts at the same time. They also didn't really even solve the Romans' initial target of regional individuality, as most monasteries had their own version of the musical squiggles and they tended to be distinct by region. It may seem obvious to us now, but the main thing that these neumes were missing was some sort of reference point so you'd know what note to start on and how the other notes relate to that. 1,000 years ago, the solution to this didn't yet exist. Enter our friend Guido of Arezzo. Guido decided to counteract the chaos of the squiggles with one addition that would elevate the neumes from a simple memory jogging tool to an accurate way of systemizing music to paper. A single straight thin red line going above the text where the neumes are. He said this line denotes the pitch of F. If a note sits above the line, it's a G. If it sits below the line, it's an E. Guido then added a second, this time yellow line to denote the pitch C. With the same logic as the F line, this had completely changed the practice of neumes. Pitch could be accurately communicated to musicians of the time, but also to people of the future, like you. Sounds had become ink. But what does this mean? Chapter 4. What this meant for music. Before Guido, there was no notational system, no way to write music down. And since him, there have been no alternatives that communicate in the same specificity. I'm sorry tabs, you're great, but you only do half the work. Because music could now be written down, harmony, melody, and rhythm could be a lot more sophisticated than the simplicity of monk plain chant, which was confined by the limits of human memory. This created the possibility of composers, people who could put pen to page as a form of musical expression rather than just improvisation or performance. Around 100 years after this notation system was developed, we see the first named composer, a Frenchman named Perotin. Music could be carefully curated and written down to be communicated to and performed by other musicians. It could also become a historical record. Not a record like that, that's kind of confusing. What I mean is, before you could record a musical record, you could keep a record of a musical record recorded down on paper rather than on a record. That makes sense, right? It also allowed devices such as counterpoints, a sort of musical Sudoku, to become possible, where two or more tunes play together at the same time and harmonize with each other. Now that music could be written down, there were billions of combinations of notes to try with each other. This would have been incredibly difficult previously without the ability to write anything down. Again, with the musical Sudoku analogy, could you play Sudoku without writing anything down? Once Guido of Arezzo had developed this system, the pace of musical development picked up incredibly fast. It wasn't long before composers were writing for full orchestras where tens of musicians could be playing different parts together at the same time, weaving complex harmonies in and out of what each other are playing, whilst a conductor leads them, interpreting the markings down on the paper in front of them to add expression to the performance. It's crazy to think that all of these musical developments just wouldn't have been able to happen in the first place without the addition of that one simple thin red line. Maybe if Pope Gregory hadn't have been so adamant that people respect his authority, there might have been another development of musical notation down the line. But if it hadn't, it's probable that music's role in our day-to-day lives would be vastly reduced from what it is now. So thanks to Guido for allowing music to flourish into the infinitely different forms it exists in today, and thanks to you for watching this video. I'll see you again in a couple weeks. Cheers!